In this session, we looked at the role of shareholders, and we asked two questions. What is their role currently? And also, perhaps the more interesting question, what should their role be? And the two questions that we started with was, first question, should we limit shareholder rights to economic rights? And if we give them governance rights, what kind of governance rights should they have? What level of influence should they have on the corporate decision-making process? Now, the first question is one of why should governance rights be given to shareholders? And the answer historically used to be they are the owners. That is no longer the case at law anyway, because the company owns its assets. But law and economics makes the point that they're residual claimants, and so giving them governance rights is efficient. It's efficient because there's a division of labor which occurs then. So we can divide between the role of being an investor with some governance rights and the role of being a director. And directors, will then be people who have the competence and the time to take these corporate decisions. There's also this observation that they are monitored by market forces, but sometimes that these market forces aren't sufficient. And then the question is, should the law intervene? And if so, how? Now, in terms of working out in this agency theory framework, why give governance rights to directors? The aspects to consider are, what are the incentives of the shareholders, and how do these incentives affect the decision making? Then also work out how much can market forces achieve, and then work out how much does it cost to have shareholders involved, and factor that into your decision. And then, of course, another one is use the law as a market failure. Approaching this question from a sort of legally positivistic theory, what you do is you look at the law in front of you, examine the rules, distill their characteristics, and then work out what the legislator wanted the law to be, and find some way of defining this nature of the shareholder relationship. And we can see here the limitations of that theoretical approach, because it's a big question, can we even do this? Is it even possible to, or how far does this take us, is perhaps the better question. And then that opens a door into a sort of school of thought that we won't talk very much about, but that's worth mentioning, and that's legal realism, which says it's actually not helpful to look at the law on its own terms. What happens in reality is that judges make up their mind on their own terms. So there's a sort of idea of judges creating their own decisions, reflecting their own personal preferences. And that would be a school of thought called legal realism. Now, then from the perspective of a sort of organizational entity theory, the starting point, I think, is to say decision-making in an organization always has, empirically observable, some central authority. So this is sort of a form of team production with a central authority. But that's an empirical observation, and the question is, why is that? And what does that mean for corporate law? And does efficiency play a role? And how much central authority should there be? So I'm not quite sure from the perspective of entity theory how much, or if anything, it can contribute to explaining the exact division of labor between shareholders and directors. It sort of can explain that it exists, but in terms of making a normative recommendation of how much should there be of it, that's still something I'm thinking about. So let's look at the way the UK allocates decision making between shareholders and directors. That's the Companies Act, saying 2 directors and a secretary, and the articles determine the power of directors. And plus, supplemented by a corporate governance code that says a successful company is led by an effective and entrepreneurial board whose role it is to promote the long-term sustainable success of the company, generating value for shareholders and contributing to wider society. So what you then find here on these following slides is a more granular list of decisions that are for shareholders, and I won't run through them. You can find them in your reading. Here is another, so here are sort of mandatory rights for shareholders. So these are a list of things that shareholders have to be involved in, that the directors cannot decide on their own. And here's some more of that. Maybe the one thing that I'm going to highlight here is there is an involvement of shareholders for something called the Class 1 transactions of listed companies, which are large-scale transactions that the company undertakes. Now, in terms of appointment, you see here that that's an important question, because the question is for how long are directors in post, and that also is sort of an indicator of how insulated they are from the shareholders. And you can see here that the general approach in the UK is that the governance code recommends annual re-election for FTSE 350 companies. So there's quite a tight connection between shareholders and directors in that sense. There's quite a high level of shareholder influence. And then removing directors, the position is that directors can be removed under the Companies Act Section 168 by a simple majority of the shareholders. And I won't go into the detail of this because that you can easily look up. But on the whole, the message is that there is a substantial influence of shareholders, at least in theory, as far as the law is concerned, on directors. The German position is different. Their directors, executive directors in any event, are more insulated from the influence of shareholders. So we see a 2-tier structure with a supervisory board and an executive board, and the shareholders elect the supervisory board through a simple majority for a period of maximum 5 years, and the supervisory board elects shareholder representatives to the executive board. So the executive board is appointed for 5 years, much longer than in the UK, through an advisory or a supervisory board, and that's appointed by the shareholders. So you can see there already a sort of the decision makers are more removed from the shareholders in German law than there are in English law. Now, removing the board is also much more difficult, which can only happen, the executive board can only be removed by the supervisory board if there is an important reason. And an important reason is a vote of no confidence by the shareholders. But that, of course, requires the shareholders to be convened and to shareholders then to take a decision to vote, to express a vote of no confidence. So that would be one route. The other route for the shareholders to remove executive board members is to remove the supervisory board with a 3/4 majority. And then the supervisory board is replaced, and you then, as shareholders, you replace the supervisory board with a new board who has a view and some evidence for important reasons to remove the executive board. Or alternative, you do both, you remove your supervisory board and express a vote of no confidence, and then your new supervisory board has to remove the existing executive board. So take away from here, the members of the executive board are subject to shareholder influence, but that influence is moderated through the supervisory board to a significant extent. And then there is something called an annual vote of no confidence, where the shareholders express their confidence in the management of the company. Plus their governance rights, which are fairly similar to the UK. Now, the US debate is in this area runs along the lines of, should there be more shareholder influence? Compared to the UK, the US has a more insulated board, insulated from shareholders, that is. And the US debate has as a key question, what about initiation rights? Initiation rights are rights where the shareholders initiate questions to put to the board. They don't exist, or rather the question is, should there be more of it? And in the UK and the Germany, they exist. So there's a sort of debate in the US, should we have initiation rights? And then there's also a possibility for, in some states, for the shareholders to be excluded from amending the charter. So that's quite a substantial influence from the shareholders over the directors. So what's the role? What's your role in this? Is to find answers to questions, and those questions are, how much shareholder influence is there? So that's a matter for studying. And the question then that follows, the more difficult one, how much should there be? What are the advantages? And what are the disadvantages? So you need to make up your mind and think about what's good about shareholder influence, what's bad about it. And then a question is, should there be mandatory law? If there is, for whose benefit? Or should we leave this to the shareholders to work out when they set up the company? And then a question that leads to next week's session is the question of, who are the shareholders? Does it make a difference what kind of shareholder structure there is? So the takeaway for revision is to formulate a position as to how much shareholder influence do we want? Why is that a good thing? Why do you, in answering a question, believe there should be more or less shareholder influence?